Morning, Sharon. How are you doing?
I'm good, Dave. How are you?
Marvelous. Yeah, not too bad. Not too bad. Quite warm. Not least because I put this ridiculous shirt on for some reason. How's things in Amsterdam?
It is a beautiful sunny summer's day in Amsterdam. So you don't move here for the weather generally. It's pretty miserable for about 9 to 10 months of the year, but the summer is absolutely glorious and it's a really, really gorgeous day today.
Fantastic. That sounds really good. Now, I think we first met somewhere around 2009 at local Gov Camp in Birmingham. Would that be it?
That sounds about right. Yeah, in a
It
sort of
does.
disused church somewhere in Birmingham.
That was it with a DJ. Those were the days.
Tom Watson, ex-MP on the decks.
Indeed, something like that, and my son had a go as well, who's now terrifyingly 20 years old. I know, right? And at the time, I think you were working in comms for Sutton Council, but you were on the Borough from Westminster or some complicated arrangement.
Yeah, that's right. They back in the day, I don't know if they still do. Westminster had a kind of consultancy arm that would lend or hire out its expertise to other councils. So the comms team down in Sutton were employed by Westminster in some sort of complicated arrangement I still don't really understand.
And what do you find yourself doing these days?
So I've been all over the place. So after local government, I went into central government. So I worked in Parliament for a couple of years as the internet manager. Then I moved into financial services and got out of government for a bit. Did that for a few years. And now I'm a sort of independent consultant. So I have my own little consultancy practice, still working in intranets, digital workplaces, but for a whole range of organisations. So government, a lot of kind of commercial sector, particularly financial services.
Fab. And I think there probably couldn't be a better time to sort of be working in the area of workplace technology and that kind of thing. What with all the certainly all the like the remote working and all of that kind of stuff that's been going on, there's had to be, I guess, a real shift in a lot of organisations around the internal tooling that they use to operate as organisations.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's been resolutely unfashionable for years, but suddenly it's come around thanks to the pandemic. I think a lot of what's been happening in this space has actually been an extension of long-term trends, but the pandemic really accelerated all of those and brought the tools that we use at work into sharp relief. They're your primary touch point with your organisation. It's the way you experience your employer brand, but ultimately it's how you get stuff done. And when we're all working remotely, it's critical that people can access the tools they need to feel engaged, feel productive, to ultimately complete whatever task they need to. And it's all suddenly brought it all into sharp focus all over again.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you heard? What's your feeling around sort of the way that organisations in all sectors have coped with this? Were there many? Do you think that sort of were in a bit of a panic situation because they just didn't have the tooling? Right.
Well, I mean, some of these things. So I was talking about an event I spoke at day before yesterday, which actually the organisations that cope the best, because I mean, a pandemic of one sort or another has been on everyone's risk register for years, but we didn't know when any of that was going to happen or what it would look like, what the impacts would be. But the organisations that cope the best of it were those that were kind of most resilient in general. So, had decent cloud-based tools, but more to the point, had the kind of governance and processes meant they could make decisions quickly and scale up or down when they needed to, bring in new tools, bring in new processes, create flexibility. So actually certain organizations, it almost made no difference to them because they were entirely working in that sort of way anyway, and that kind of asynchronous type of working. I know particularly legacy organizations like banks struggled in the first instance because they're still, for lots of reasons, using a lot of on-prem type technology that just didn't enable them to do that quickly, and it meant that they were trying to steer a big ship very slowly in something of a storm.
Fab. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? And the big winners, I suppose, technology-wise, out of the pandemic, obviously, Zoom, which we're using now, is one of those big ones. One of the others, of course, is Teams with Microsoft, which is a slightly different beast to Zoom because it's kind of got a bit of Slack in it as well, hasn't it? Yeah. Albeit, Microsofty. But I mean, but whatever the pros and cons of that, introducing a technology like Teams, it changes the way that organizations work, don't they? Because of that, some of that movement away from email and things like that, and into very rapidly introducing sort of internal chat as a way of communicating, which I think even those organizations that I've worked in where it's been available, it's by no means been the default thing that people do, but I think that's changed, hasn't it?
So I heard a good description the other day, which is that generally speaking, attitudes change and then behaviors. So we fundamentally start to kind of cogitate and then go, well, that might be a good idea. And then we'll try it out in general. But what's happened with the pandemic is we had to change our behaviors because we were forced to. And our attitudes are sort of catching up with that a little bit. So, even the most recalcitrant managers are starting to, or were very quickly forced to recognize it is possible to work remotely. And then actually our ways of working start to catch up with that. What seems to have happened, however, is sent everyone home with Teams or Zoom or whatever it was that your organization was using. And then everyone sort of developed whatever habits, no one got training on it. You had to work it out. Teams have just worked out their kind of communication cadence and preferences between themselves. We've actually got some really terrible habits as well. So what you find is actually it's shifted over to everyone just having a million meetings on Teams or Zoom, which is exhausting. We've quickly all found out. People haven't entirely shifted to, right, how can we properly work asynchronously? How can we use chat or whatever it might be amongst that communication mix? Like Teams does loads of stuff. Most people never touch 90% of it. If they do, they use it really badly, as a replacement for email. So we've actually, it's created a shift. It's certainly created a mindset shift. Has it created the right kind of behavior shift? Are we using those tools as well as we could? Probably not. And I think that's something we're going to have to unpick over the next couple of years as we kind of move into whatever the next stage looks like. So I think we've kind of got to this point where as organizations, we're like, okay, we reckon this can work. There's loads of inefficiency in it. And actually, if we're really to seize the benefits of working these new remote ways, and there are loads of them beyond the obvious, actually, I think we need to think a bit more smartly around how we get work done. And that's where all of this stuff becomes much more critical.
Fab. And do you think, as well, we've had Freedom Day, of course, here in the UK, and I must admit I've still got my mask on most of the time, and that's not changing. Nor am I going to any raves anytime soon. But although that's nothing to do with the pandemic.
No, I'm 41, so
yeah, exactly right. But organisations are starting to have to think about, what is this more hybrid way of working going to look like, and also fixing some of the things that you've just spoken about. Are some of the people you're talking to in terms of organisations, coming to you for help in terms of how do we figure out how this is going to work?
Absolutely. So a lot of the organisations I'm working with now, intranets have been unfashionable for years, and people have kind of recognised, okay, well, actually, this becomes critical in our hybrid work future or whatever model they're looking at. Actually, people need these tools in order to be productive. But actually, what's the right combination, not just of tools, but actually capabilities, processes, practices, mindsets that we need around those in order to make the most of our investment, but also to actually fundamentally rethink how we operate as an organisation. So there's some pretty much all the large, companies in the UK and across Europe have said, okay, we're not going back to how things were before. Just yesterday, NatWest's, was it chairman, said, the way that we interact with big cities will fundamentally change because spending your day on the Northern Line is not a good use of anyone's time, which, most of us worked out over the last few years anyway. Actually, so all of this becomes much more critical in how we move to a kind of a post-pandemic world of work. But kind of related to that is we think about this only in relation to technology and to COVID, lots of other changes also happening at the same time. So, actually, a lot of these were trends that were already in train. It's just sped them up a little bit. So, if you think about the impact of changing demographics on our organizations, we're more diverse than we used to be. We're much more multi-generational than we used to be. That actually means that we have to address some of these challenges anyway. It's just forced us to do it a bit more quickly. And there's some really interesting stuff going on there. I mean, a lot of it is is commercially confidential, but Essex are doing a really, really good job on this. I don't work with Essex, but they've done some what they're doing is actually address it from like a user needs perspective, and how can we fundamentally think about what are the potential benefits for us as an organization, for our employees, for our local community, for our taxpayers, in rethinking the way that we get work done. And that's where I think it could get super, super interesting. So they are looking at, actually, if people don't want to commute from Essex into where it is Liverpool Street, how can we help them to keep on working in Chelmsford? Can we have more of our people working from home by using these remote technologies, but also bring more business or life back into our own town centres by turning our council offices into kind of local co-work hubs for people who maybe can't work at home, but also don't want to commute into London anymore, which has potential benefits in, work-life balance, but also for their local economy. So some really interesting stuff that happens there. And the tools, process and practice associated with intranets and digital workplaces help to unlock that, but it is a part of rethinking it more in the round.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the other potential impact there is around recruitment and stuff as well, isn't it? Which suddenly the potential talent pool available to organisations becomes a lot bigger. And in my world of local government, though, I think that presents another challenge as well, which is that how much of the passion and motivation for a worker, for a local authority, comes from the fact that they live or at very least sort of turn up for work in that place. And therefore there's a physical connection. Does it matter that somebody might live hundreds of miles away?
I think it's a particular challenge for local authorities that it wouldn't be for other organisations, in that they are both definition grounded in a sense of place, but also it's kind of, I imagine it would be reputationally risky to say these are really good quality local jobs paid for by local taxpayers, done by someone potentially in a different part of the country, or even not in the UK at all. Theoretically, actually, I think that's going to be a difficult ask, and it might not sit well with people. So we do need to start addressing some of those challenges. To what extent are we going to allow people to work from home? Will it be in the county? Will it be within a particular radius? There's challenges there around how can we use this to attract the talent we need that might otherwise be hard to recruit in maybe specialist roles. On the other hand, I know we don't require people to move here, but that is a job that now no longer sits in the local community. There's a tension there.
Yeah, no, absolutely, for sure. You've mentioned intranets, a couple of times there, and like you say, that they're perhaps can be considered a sort of rather unsexy part of all of this.
Yeah, the website's ugly stepsister, right?
Yeah, indeed, and it's an opportunity, isn't it? I think for more focus to be put on the intranet, because it becomes even more of an important hub when you've got people who are displaced and all over the place, doesn't it? So have you seen a renewed focus on making intranets just a little bit better?
Absolutely. I think it's a recognition that when you are working at home, when you're in, you've got a disparate, disconnected, distributed workforce, actually it's the number one way you experience your employer brand. It's, we need to, the thing that keeps us coming to work, apart from obviously the money, is actually our sense of relatedness to other people. Fundamentally, we like the people we work with, and it's your manager and your colleagues that stop you from moving elsewhere. The challenge we have is when your only interaction with the people you work with is through the screen, actually all of those minor irritants that you might have experienced start to become magnified. So it's like, if it's hard for me to get work done, then so the user experience of work, the tools that you use, suddenly become much more important than they were, because you don't have other workworkarounds. This is the only way that you can do it. The other thing is actually, how can we contribute to that sense of community, of relatedness? I like my colleagues. In order for me to get things done, I rely on the trust that I've developed with them. If people haven't seen their colleagues for a year, that trust is starting to kind of erode. So actually, how can we help to rebuild it? And that's when we start to look at things like the community and collaboration tools that you might find within the digital workplace, because they help us to either build or maintain that sense of connectedness that we have with other people. And again, this is why organizations are starting to go, all right, we'd better start looking anew at how, firstly, does it do all of these things effectively, but also the general sort of experience of the full tool set. So the problem we've had historically within the kind of enterprise space is that each tool will be bought by a different department. And frankly, they're a hot mess of user experiences, overlapping functionality, the governance is all over the shop. And it means that as an end user, you often, there's no decent signposting, it's hard to know what tool does what. And actually, we need to start looking at that more holistically and going, right, what's the user experience of work, particularly for someone who never goes in?
Yes, indeed. It's really, really, really important. And so what are you saying in terms of the intranet as a thing? Excuse me. Where's the sort of the focus going to be on? Because I think we mentioned before we started recording that great cartoon that you showed around the actual sort of user needs around an intranet and the stuff that usually gets put on it, which tends to be a focus on sort of corporate stuff and less on what people are actually after. What's going to be the sort of the balance there in the future to be able to sort of create that sense of trust and things that people need?
I'm starting to see a huge focus on, okay, how can people get the information they genuinely need to do their job as quickly as possible? So there's a move away from where can we put all the corporate content of a photo of the CEO or, you know, some sort of blog of any of your senior leaders, to ultimately, you know, can people find the policies, procedures they need, but build that sense of connectedness and engagement with the organization as well. So they're becoming much more kind of collaborative community type spaces. How can we embed our sense of who we are, our DNA as an organization much more fully? But again, also really much more task focused on genuinely, does this help people to do their job? Can they get to the transactional tools that they need, the information they need, potentially the processes and policies they need as quickly as possible so they can go about and do the thing that they are actually trying to do, that task-based stuff? Because we're actually starting to get a sense as well, it's only a little bit related to this, but actually we're starting to see that kind of emergence of employee surveillance. How do we measure productivity for people who aren't in the office? Because you can't see where they come in, we can't see what hours people are working. And then the flip side of that is also we have some of those challenges around overwork as well. So we're starting to see a lot more monitoring of people's time and using of how we're using metrics to measure, you know, who's doing what and when and what hours people are online. So it's starting to interact with some of that a bit more as well.
Great. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. That stuff around community and things. I can remember, a few years ago, a great deal of excitement about the enterprise social network and all of that kind of thing. And YAML was all the rage for a little while and that kind of thing. It all seems to have died a bit of a death recently. People don't tend to talk about it too much. What's the state of the internal social network and things? And,
I think they're still there, but I think, like all community, and there's a recognition that community doesn't happen by itself. So there is a bit of, actually, it's a growing movement of the need for community managers inside organisations. So that in the past, there's always been a sense of, you know, if you build it, they will come. And actually, you need to take a much more structured approach to internal communities, and, you know, are they communities of identity or expertise? Actually, what are they for? Are we helping people to build their tribe around particular areas of work, for example? Are they around projects? So I'm starting to see much more of a structured approach to how we use communities. Again, you know, if we're thinking about, what is it, the hype curve, I think they've just gone beyond the peak, and actually you're at the point of genuinely being useful in the right context, but useful, but probably less talked about. So they are pretty active, particularly inside large organizations, in a more mundane sort of way.
Yeah, fine. There's that thing, isn't there? I can't remember who said it, but the point at which a technology becomes interesting is the point when it becomes boring. Exactly. Certainly when it becomes useful is when, you know, it just becomes mainstreamed into things. So we're seeing a move away from sticking a comment box on the bottom of everything or allowing you to rate your news because frankly no one cares, to actually, how can we help people to collaborate, to share ideas, to create that sense of relatedness with one another and with the organization? Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think certainly, you know, I'm in some of the local councils I've been working in recently, you know, I've seen very little of that kind of organic sort of internal social networking going on.
Yeah, I don't think it's used so much in the public sector. It's one of those things that it's hard to make a business case for community, in that you're like, actually, what's the value of a running community? Now, certainly for a public sector organisation, there's always that sense of the Daily Mail test that you have to justify some of that. Now, the argument behind it is if someone participates in, say, a community about running or gardening, whatever it is, they're actually developing mastery of the tools itself, which means that they can then use that skill to then collaborate on work tasks. So it's actually about helping you to develop the sense of how to work within an online community. But the other thing is it helps you to feel connected to the organization itself, which has kind of secondary benefits around engagement. The challenge is, of course, making that sort of argument in that sort of fiscally tight environment that, you know, where it's much harder to justify giving people things that are not obviously work related.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? And because I'm a big fan of sort of online community building and stuff, and I've always been a sort of proponent of the need for good community management. And I find that certainly that the tools that are more recently emerged, like Slack and Teams and things like that, they are not, I don't think, community platforms at all. I find them quite closed, almost antisocial in some ways.
I don't know about you, but I'm in a whole bunch of kind of professional Slack communities of one sort or another around specific interests. But I've never seen them work outside a kind of nerd context. So they're great tech teams of one kind or another. Trying to scale Slack in particular outside the digital parts of your organization, it's just too technical for a kind of lay audience.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think they are for teams rather than communities as well. I think it's the feeling that I have, and sometimes you look at some of them, and particularly those ones that are like trying to work cross organisations, to run a community of practice effectively in them. And I just kind of think, just give me a forum, please. Let's go old school on this.
I was talking to John the other day, my business partner, and he and I talked about actually coming out of the pandemic. Obviously, the winners are Zoom and Teams. But Workplace by Facebook is an interesting one, because obviously it's still used by millions of people worldwide, particularly in kind of retail and stuff like that. But interestingly, it's not the dominant player I thought it would be at this stage of the game. That Zoom, people were able to justify going, look, we've got a really urgent need. It does one thing and everyone gets it. And suddenly organizations got Zoom in. I know someone at a very major bank who said it was the fastest contract they've ever signed with a vendor. Because they were like, we're absolutely screwed, we need to get this sorted, and barriers were removed, and then at the same time people were able to introduce Teams because they already had Microsoft, and it was an extent, they probably already had Teams, they just weren't using it. So both of those things meant that somehow it felt like the workplace space, which is much more user friendly, much more suitable for a kind of maybe low digital confidence audience, somehow fell between two of those things. Like, it does too many things to get through procurement quickly, but also so it kind of felt like somehow it didn't achieve the dominance I thought it would in that period. But interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's a strange one. I mean, I to be honest with you, a lot of the times I forget that Workplace, even exists, and and I've never used it. I've never been invited to use one. So, my particular
I quite like it as a tool, but it suffers from the obvious drawback of being from Facebook, which is there's lots of people who won't use it for exactly that reason. Fundamentally, because that's what it is. It's a barrier you can't remove or ameliorate.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, it's in some senses it's a strength, but it's also a weakness. Absolutely. For an awful lot of people, isn't it? Yeah, which is a shame. How have you found that? Have you had much feedback from the organisations you work with in terms of, obviously you spoke earlier about the fact that we kind of just all had to blast these tools out to people and leave them to get on with it. People's sort of digital confidence with using some of these tools, has that been much of a barrier, do you think, in terms of not just adoption of them, because to a certain extent people have had to use them, they've been forced into it, but is there a thing about the way that they're being used well and stuff that actually we really need to start looking at our digital skills and digital confidence raising among the workforce to get the best out of this stuff?
Oh, absolutely. And you get the sense that you get kind of, it's the confidence gap apart from anything else. You've got people who are explorers. So the way that part of the appropriation process of any technology is, you start to play around with it. You might do some sort of formalized learning on how it works, whether that's just the click through at the beginning of the tool or some kind of course. Then you start to, understand it in the context of your own work. And then you start to find kind of new affordances for it. So you can find applications for it in your own space. But a lot of people have really only got to that first stage. It's only, how do we help people to find those uses and affordances for the tools that they have, and then actually fully start to adopt some of the capabilities that they offer. So what we've all seen, I think, is people just using it as a replacement for how they used to work in the office, which is how people feel comfortable. But actually the real benefits will be unlocked when we start to adopt or use what those tools already offer in order to transform the way that we get work done. So starting to work more asynchronously, starting to, actually a lot of it is a communication thing. So the skills aren't necessarily digital, because in the past, you had to be a bit technical to work out how all this stuff works.
Yeah.
Actually, it's pretty intuitive these days. The things that are a challenge are learning to work in a different way. So that's asynchronously as opposed to being in the room. But also it's a communication thing. So actually, for me, the number one management skill now is writing stuff down. Actually, we're not very good at it. And it's very countercultural that all managers, particularly kind of middle managers, are used to keeping stuff to themselves or, sharing a meeting or having a form. And I think, actually, we need to learn to work out loud a bit more, because if you don't see people, a lot of what we learn at work, whether that's, in terms of skills we learn or just our kind of awareness of what's going on, we learn in a sort of ambient kind of way. So you overhear what's happening, or, you might learn your trade from hearing how someone else gets stuff done. So, when someone picks up the phone, how do they have that conversation? And when you're earlier in your career, that's how you learn to get that sort of stuff done. We're missing a lot of that opportunity. So some of the criticism of the remote working kind of movement is it denies younger people or those at the beginning of their career the opportunity to learn from that. Now, that's true. That doesn't mean that we all have to go back to the office in order to provide those learning opportunities. What we might need to do is actually just get better at narrating what we're doing. So those of us who are, of slightly older vintage actually need to get better at sharing what we're doing, sharing our work in progress, sharing our half-finished documents and saying, this is what I'm working on now, actually, and particularly succinctly and clearly describing what we're doing and what we need other people to do, instead of just throwing crap out there, which is what we're often guilty of doing.
Well, yes, exactly.
So actually, it means that managers are really having to relearn how to manage. So it's not about supervision; it's actually about communication.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the other one is motivation as well, which is quite a big one, isn't it? How do you, I always used to be one for in the office, spending a little bit of time each day, just kind of just wandering around and just sort of stopping by people's desks and having a quick natter with them, and about stuff. And, that's incredibly difficult to do. Well, no, it's not. No, I'll take that back entirely, because it's very easy to do. All I have to do is press a button on a screen and phone someone up and ask them how they're doing and what's going on and stuff. But for some reason, to get into the space to feel like I can do that is challenging for some reason.
And there's also this kind of sense of the formal versus informal communication. So if I put some time in a diary, like you and I have got now, we're having a specific formal conversation that's got an agenda and stuff like that. And I'm, on the one hand, I like to refuse invites that don't have an agenda in them, because they often end up being a waste of time and we're all catching. But on the other hand, that kind of informal catch up, how are you kind of stuff becomes much harder to do. So there's that, just you don't get that sense of, when someone's having a bad day because you can see it on their face. If you have a formal check-in with them for 20 minutes on video, it's it's very easy to mask that kind of thing that you wouldn't be able to do if they were in the same physical space. There's also those more actually gossip is really useful in how organizations get stuff done. It's how you find out who's doing what, but also you unlock access to people. And we've lost a lot of that as well, those kind of informal opportunities to find out what the hell's going on, or those kind of serendipitous moments that you might get over coffee, or people having a cigarette break out the back is where the real business happens. So actually, how can we, if not necessarily recreate those moments, we're not going to have a Zoom fag break, I don't think, anytime soon, but actually, how do we enable people to have those sort of spontaneous connections that help them to unlock ideas, or just feel inspired, or just get that kind of ambient sense of what the hell's going on?
Maybe just while we've been having this chat, I thought maybe like the Google I'm feeling lucky option, maybe we just need one of those, like in Teams or whatever, which just randomly dials someone from your team and you've got no idea who it is until they answer it, and then you can have a serendipitous
There's something called
chat.
Donut, which kind of sets up a coffee meeting, but again, it's sort of semi-formalized. I don't know the answer to this one at all. I've seen kind of having a permanent room open on Zoom that people can just drop into, see who's around, but again, it is a bit clunky, and maybe it is that sense as we start to come out of this and out the other side, is how do we use the times that we are in the office together to really focus on building those connections and allowing people to have that kind of unstructured time.
Yeah, it feels like that those times where the physical meetings are possible, that actually you should use that time to do anything other than work. I suspect that might be the thing. That's the opportunity to do the social stuff, because we've tried to recreate social situations by having like regular times and things like that where people can get together for it. But the trouble is, it's more talking on Teams, which is what I'm doing all the time, the rest of the time. And if I've got a bit of a gap, I want to go and have a snooze, or I want to go and, or maybe even get some work done, but definitely not talk to more people on Teams.
I know. And I think we all started we've had that kind of curve of, initially there was that wave of excitement, all the Zoom quizzes. And then we came out of that first lockdown last summer. And somehow once we got back into the second lockdown, so I'm not doing that again. No. I think we all kind of recognized it was just way too much, and that we need to use this kind of one-on-one time effectively, but also give people the space to actually be able to focus on tasks. But all of that is really kind of, for that to happen, we need to have a clear idea of what's expected of us, but also we need to have some trust within the organization and the team that, that leaders are being honest with us, that our managers are confident that we're getting on with what we're supposed to. And all of that is actually about having that strong relationships between people. The flip side of that is where trust is absent, you're starting to see bad management behaviors kind of amplified as well.
I'm sure that's inevitably going to happen, isn't it? I dare say everything's amplified, isn't it? The good and the bad, I suspect, with all of that kind of stuff. Listen, Sharon, this has been brilliant. I feel like we could probably keep talking about this for another few hours, but nobody would probably want to listen to that. But maybe if we broke it down and we had another go at this in the future, that'd be great. But that's been absolutely fantastic, actually. So full of insight and everything. There's so much there I think for folk to chew on. So that's been absolutely brilliant. If people want to find you on the internet and that kind of thing to bother you and maybe even like procure your services, how do they go about doing that?
Well, I'm on I've just Google me really, but it's sharonodea.co.uk or Sharon O'Dea on Twitter. It's the best way to get hold of me.
Fantastic, that sounds great, and thanks ever so much for your time.
Lovely to chat to you. It's been far too long. Cheers.
It has indeed. Bye. Cheers, Sharon. Bye-bye.